Welcome to Pasa, HSIs, a podcast dedicated to everything Hispanic serving institutions. I'm your host, Dr. Gina Ann Garcia, bringing you the news on what's happening in HSIs. Join us as we explore the history and evolution of HSIs, culturally relevant and liberatory practices, current and emerging research with HSIs, and the policies that shape servingness. Saludos, HSI familia, and welcome to the inaugural episode of ¿Qué Pasa, HSIs? I am so excited to launch this podcast created with and for HSI practitioners and scholars. I have been dreaming about this podcast for several years, and I'm thankful that I finally had the creative time, energy, and team to make it happen. I want to send a big shout out to Alan A.C. Williams for all the behind the scenes production work, Estefania Toledo for promoting the show, and Imani Chapman for helping me move my dreams into reality. It is not by chance that the inaugural episode of ¿Qué Pasa, HSIs is available on September 12th, 2012, which is the first day of HSI Week. According to the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, or HACU, HSI Week is a time to host campus activities that heighten awareness of the important role HSIs play in improving access to education and advancing equity for traditionally underserved students. What better way to do that than with a podcast dedicated to HSIs and the students they serve? In this first episode, I talked to Dr. Stephanie Aguilar-Smith, an assistant professor of counseling and higher education at the University of North Texas, about federal HSI policies and servingness. Her research examines educational policies, higher education as a hierarchical stratified system, and the ways that these trends shape HSIs. In the episode, we explore the complexities of federal policies that shape servingness and learn about the motivation of HSI grant seekers when they pursue this stream of funding. Before joining the University of North Texas, Dr. Aguilar-Smith worked at several research universities in a variety of areas, including enrollment management, academic counseling, program development and evaluation, and writing center administration. She has a PhD in higher adult and lifelong administration and certificate in Chicano and Latino studies from Michigan State University, holds a master's in public administration with a specialization in higher education administration, and has 2 BAs, one in journalism and one in international affairs from the University of Georgia. These experiences had led her to question many dimensions of policy and elevated her commitment to demonstrating how structural forces foreclose and open opportunities for individuals and organizations, and elevating possibilities for equity-oriented change within racialized organizations such as HSIs. On a personal note, I first met Dr. Aguilar-Smith at the Association for the Study of Higher Education's annual conference, where she asked me to sign her copy of my book, Becoming Hispanic Serving Institutions. I was honored and have watched her trajectory since, also serving on the ASH board with her a few years later. I also served as guest editor for her article in AERA Open entitled Seeking to Serve or Serve with a $, Hispanic Serving Institutions, Race Evasive Pursuit of Racialized Fundings, which is available in the show notes. You can follow her on social media to learn more about her research and about the topics we explore in this episode. All righty, let's go ahead and get started with today's show. Dr. Stephanie Aguilar-Smith, thank you for taking the time to be here with today on ¿Qué Pasa, HSIs, where we talk about all things HSIs.
And thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to chat and learn with you.
Awesome. So before we really jump into what's going on with HSIs and what's up with HSIs, we want to learn a little bit about you, because the show is, of course, about higher ed. Hispanic serving institutions are part of the higher ed system. So tell us a little bit about your higher education journey and how you got to where you are, from Georgia to Michigan to Texas.
Sure. So I think maybe like most folks, like my life is half happenstance, half intentionality. So when we immigrated to the U.S., and my family is from Venezuela, we moved to Kentucky, and then we eventually settled in kind of like the metro Atlanta-ish sprawl area, not the cool part of Atlanta, okay, like an hour and a half in traffic both ways. And because of financial reasons, I had to stay in state, and I had received the Hope Scholarship, which covered the cost of or the price of attendance for the most part. And so I went to the University of Georgia, mostly as a byproduct of just I had to be within a certain geographic bubble for my home. It was a rule with my parents because I was moving out and they were making a big concession to allow me to move out.
Yes, that's common.
Yeah,
Latino parents.
Yeah, exactly. And then that I could afford it, or that we could try to make it work. And then I have, in some ways, or at least in this way, maybe very stereotypical immigrant parents. They were like, you can be a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer, or maybe go into business, right? Kind of how states made decisions and how those bore down on individuals. So that's always kind of geeked me out. But because they were like, that's unemployable, and they were pretty about that, I said, okay, I'll meet you in the middle, and I'll get some kind of practical skill. And so I agreed. I was like, I'll learn how to write and tell stories. And so I got a degree in public relations through the School of Journalism, which I don't think totally appeased them, but it was enough to like survive family discussions about my ability to ever be employed. Which those things have now come to really be really helpful. I think really shaped the way I think about my work, about how like narratives are formed really strategically, how interest groups make informed decision making. So all those things actually do come to be helpful in how I think now, but at the time, not so much. And I've just had like superb luck. I basically graduated right after the Great Recession, where there was really few jobs. And then I graduated from my PhD also during the height of COVID and all the hiring freezes. So 2 for 2 with that. And so at the time I was like, oh, the market for a job is looking really challenging, right? And particularly when I graduated. And so I decided to get my master's, mostly because my mom was like, this is the time, like there's no jobs or there's no, there's few jobs. And so I got a master's in public administration because again, I was still interested in how kind of more the, like, international affairs is like big picture. And so I was like, maybe smaller picture, how do actual bureaucrats or street level actors do that kind of work? As part of that, you had to pick kind of a concentration area. One of the concentration areas happened to be in higher education administration. And I was like, that's cool. I can get into that. And I also had to have an internship. That was a requirement of the degree. Because I had been what they call like a fellow during my undergraduate, working for the public service and outreach unit for the University of Georgia, which is really the public service outreach for the state. Working with Latinx educational programming, particularly for high school youth. I had met through that someone in admissions. And so when I needed an internship, I was like, hey, will you give me a job? Because I need to have this to graduate. And he did. He gave me a job. That job became, that internship became an assistantship. That assistantship became a full-time job when I graduated. And then it kind of exposed me to the different ways or different opportunities within higher ed, because I didn't even know that was a field you could go into. And then, I fell into it and then I fell in love with it. And that just became, a career. Again, life happens. My partner got a promotion. He's like, we have to move to Mississippi. So that's what love looks like when it unfolds. I moved to Mississippi, and I ended up working in academic advising. Which I really enjoyed. But my boss was very candid. And during one of my evals, basically said, if you ever want my job, you have to have a doctorate in hand. And that's just the way it is. And I was like, well, okay, if that's how it is, then I'm going to start considering like different opportunities to look for a doctorate. That ended up me going to Michigan State, not the other Michigan, Michigan State. And it was great. And so I ended up in Michigan, basically under advice of some mentors and finances and all the pragmatics of picking a place. So yeah, and then when the again having to graduate in the COVID bubble, where there was very limited options on the table,
Mhm.
I put out really strategically the ones that I actually thought not only would they maybe consider interviewing me, but would I want to live there?
Right.
So like that combination, also because I'm partnered and I needed to make sure it could be a place where he could likewise continue his job.
Right.
I landed at the University of North Texas, which is perfect. You know, it was a wish list item that the place that I worked at could be an HSI, but I couldn't make that like a must have. So it was kind of a luck, great timing. The call really aligned with my interests and what they needed. And it was close to an international airport, so I could go home. So that combination made it like, and also my colleagues are wonderful. So that really helped.
Shout out to colleagues at University of North Texas.
They are, cool. They're great. So that's how I ended up in Texas.
That's how you ended up there. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. And I like how you came into higher ed. It very much aligns with what we know from higher ed research that, generally our Latinx students, our Latina students make decisions in much the same way you do, in consultation with their parents, right? And also often close to home. So I very much think, that we have to think about that, right? As we get into talking about HSIs, is like, that's an important consideration, right? Is like that's how a lot of Latino students, not all, but a lot of Latino students are going to make decisions about where they go. And so wherever they live, there's only so many choices where they might actually go, which is why HSIs, of course, pop up regionally based on where the populations are. So with that, let's transition a little bit to Servingness. So neither of your institutions that you went to, that you named University of Georgia or Michigan State prior to getting to University of North Texas, are HSIs. So tell us about your Servingness journey. How did you get into thinking about HSIs and writing about HSIs?
Yeah, no, I went to extremely predominantly white institutions, which in some ways made me, I think, more attracted to figuring out spaces that were more Latinx centered or Latinx, like thinking, at least considering that Latinx existed, right? Especially Michigan is extremely white, as is a lot of the, not all of the Midwest, right? But Michigan in particular, right? In that particular area. So that I actually have a certificate in Chicano and Latino studies because I was trying to find research and things that were somewhat related to the Latinx community that I could then kind of couple with my higher ed background. And so I could kind of marry those like two interests together because I wasn't getting a lot of that kind of literature within like strictly higher ed courses, right? But as again, so much happenstance in my life. We had to go on a policy trip. That's part of our curriculum or was, it still is at Michigan State, to DC. And you have to, part of that, they set up a bunch of different meetings with policy actors from different representatives. And one of the folks was from HACU, so the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities. And he talked a lot about HSIs and specifically about Title V. And then I was like, I felt like I had this like whoa moment, because I had been looking for something, given that my master's is in public admin. I knew I was interested in policy. I always knew I was interested in something related to the Latinx community. That always came in as my two bubbles of interest, or buckets rather. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is perfect. Because I didn't know anything about them. I'd never been exposed. I'd never read an article. And then that became this like, how do you say when you like fall into something and then it's like keeps going? Oh, there's some idiom. Oh, well, I'm terrible at idioms. But yeah, it became like this. I was so geekily excited because I finally felt like I found something that made sense. And one of the best pieces of advice that my advisor gave me, who is Dr. Patricia Marin, so I'll shout her out as well.
Yes, shout out to Patricia Marin.
She was like, whatever you choose to study, make sure that you love it. That like you can be excited about it because it's a really long road if you don't love what you're studying. And you need to find, you need to be geekily excited about it. It doesn't matter if I am or not. She's like, because you have to spend a long time devoted to that. And so you keep reading the articles and they're still exciting to you, that's a good sign. And it was. And so that is how I fell into the HSI kind of conversation and scholarship. I always wondered, like, what if, like, I hadn't been a speaker? Like, I wonder what I would have studied instead.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Cause I think the servingness journey for me, I love that question because we all have a different way we sort of came into it. Right. And it doesn't necessarily mean because you went to one or you worked at one. But for you, it's like you found the policy side of it was interesting to you. And I see you wrote a book review for my book, Becoming Hispanic Serving Institutions. And I distinctly remember when we first met, it was at ASH, the Association for the Study of Higher Ed. And you had just gotten my book and I was excited because the book was new. And I never knew you actually wrote a book review for it. So thank you for that. I came across it as I was, getting into your work a little bit more. So thank you for that. So tell me a little bit about the book and about how it's informed your work as one of those key pieces that you kind of kept going down. I think of rabbit hole. I don't know if rabbit hole is the right. Is it rabbit hole? Okay. I was like, are you talking about a rabbit hole? Maybe. But yeah, where it's like you just keep going down the rabbit hole and finding more and more and more. So tell me more about the book and how it informed you, because I love to get feedback, right? And even just think like, how is it helping people think about their own work and a starting point, for your own thinking and whatnot.
Yeah. So I love the book. That's not no surprise.
Thank you.
But but it's not just because it's on HSIs. It's like how it's laid out and how it's written, right? Because there's a bunch of stuff that's on HSIs, and this one I like in particular because it's something I can keep reading and go back to. And also, as a I'll talk about how it informs my work, but it's just such a useful text in general, because I think it can speak to broader audiences in ways that a lot of times academic books fail to do well. Or we talk really great to 3 people. It's hard to talk to people at large, and this book excels at that. And so much so that I just got asked to teach a special topics course on MSIs, or minority serving institutions, when I come back from parental leave. And I'm assigning the text for my students.
Woohoo! Thank you.
Yeah, but I also think it's one that it's a great conversation starter, right? It's really, I think, accessible in the sense that students can really resonate with it and understand what you mean. But in terms of the actual text, for me, it's chapter 1.
Okay.
That chapter is especially helpful because I think you do a really nice job of talking about the racialization process that happens with HSIs and how they can be understood as racialized organizations and racialized institutions, right? Organizations, and how they're still within this really within a field, right, that really values whiteness, and how that comes to bear down on the way they're evaluated, judged, resourced, right, in comparison to white dominant standards. And I think that it's a very useful, not only reminder, but way to explain that to other people, right? It also helps when I'm thinking about my own work about, I think sometimes there's an assumption just if we were thinking about people, right? You think as a person of color, I'm not going to do X thing. But a lot of times people of color, me included, have done things from really valuing white dominant standards, right? Living into those things, much in the same way HSI sometimes reify white dominant practices. And this book helps explain why that might be to me, or it gives me language to talk about why do we see that when people are going after Title V grants that they might be thinking about positioning it for all students. I think it does a good job of explaining why those things might actually unfold within, even within racially minoritized organizations.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And so it has informed your work then, reading it was one of those rabbit hole moments.
Yeah, that first chapter was just so good.
Well, thank you for that. But I am equally a fan of the work that you're doing. I really enjoyed, working with you as, guest editor for the AERA Open issue and learning about your work through the article, The Seeking to Serve or Serve with the $sign and the S, Hispanic Serving Institutions, Race Evasive Pursuit of Racialized Funding. And so you talk a little bit about, well, you talk extensively about the motivation that practitioners at HSIs have for pursuing and applying for HSIs. So tell us a little bit about that article. If the people listening haven't read, give us the plug, convince them that they should read it, because I think they should, and it's accessible. So we'll drop it in the show link for sure too.
Sure. Yeah. So this actually came out of my dissertation, but I collected the data while doing my dissertation, but it's not included in my dissertation. It was kind of beyond what I could fit in the dis, if that makes sense.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Yep.
And so, but one of the things that when I was having conversations with these different folks was like, why'd you even go after this money? I was curious it was kind of separate from my actual dissertation questions. I was just curious, like, why were you even going after it? And it was kind of a conversation starter. And so I'm going to take a step back for folks who haven't read it. Essentially, I spoke with 29 institutional actors at 17 HSIs across the country that were either really really persistent Title V applicants, and that's both persistent and unsuccessful, and persistent and successful, meaning folks that want a lot of grants and folks that tried really hard to win grants. And then I also spoke to non-applicants as well. In this study, I was only thinking about applicants, like, why'd you go after the money? And kind of learned that it's complicated. You go after money for a lot of different reasons. And some of them make a lot of sense, right? Like some folks were saying, we go after the money because we have to pool money, if you think about, sometimes I like to bring things back to people because I think it makes it easier to understand. But, when I was a grad student, I was scrappy. I had quit my full-time job. So I had my GA-ship. I was working an hourly job. I was copying any on this. I was hustling, right? Trying to get all pots of money because I felt financially precarious, right? In much the same way, organizations, that are dealing with constant declines in public funding and not knowing, like, is your state going to cut funding or is it not? When you're dealing with that kind of uncertainty, you're going to try to pool resources, very much in that kind of resource dependency kind of theory perspective. And so they kind of talked about that. They're like, we need to pool money because we don't have any, or we're worried we're not going to have any. The other ones were in some ways related, right? Like we have these really kind of broad-based kind of institutional needs. Again, when you're dealing with precarity, you're like, I can't invest this little that I have in this thing, even though we might really need it, because I'm scared that there might be a huge cut and then I need that pool, right? And so a lot of them talked about, we have this program and we know we have interest, but it's really expensive to launch a program. And so we need this funding as a way to kind of meet that gap, right? Others talked about signaling legitimacy, and this was really interesting to me. In particular, I think I heard it mostly from folks at community colleges, although that could also be a function of the sample. I'd be curious to see if that applied more broadly. But we're basically saying like grant seeking, but more so grant getting, signals that you're legitimate, right? Like legitimate schools pull in money, and they pull in big bucks. They pull in these big federal dollars, and that signals in both, right? That like we're legit, but also that we're really part of this HSI space, and capture these dollars. It was also having to do with kind of like the politics of money getting, where institutions said, there's an expectation from either the board of trustees or things like that, that you're going after all the pots available to you. And that's what real schools do, right? Which I was somewhat surprised to hear that. I mean, it makes total sense when I think about the literature, but I was surprised to actually hear it so directly. And the other one, not as surprising, but basically this idea of needing this money to really support students, and particularly all students, right? Where then you could have this kind of trickle down effect and potentially help also Latinx students. There was some folks that admittedly said, it'd be great to be able to invest in things that are really specific to Latinx students, but most were very clear that it was for all students, and that by proxy, it would help Latinx students.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
No.
so, yeah, so basically especially with that last one, to me, it kind of, that's where I kind of make the argument, there's this capitalization that happens where like you have to enroll, you're the minimum 25% of Latinx students and Pell eligible students as well. And then you're using that to serve all students, kind of subverts to me the purpose of the program.
Right.
And so it's like, just this capitalization or commodification of Latinx students for the benefit of the institution as a whole, rather than thinking about how it might be of particular benefit to the students that make you eligible for that funding.
Right. Yeah, I remember just really, digging into the article multiple times, reading it over and over again, and grappling with all those different things you presented, because I think a lot of people do exactly what you said, right? There's research, right? You even cite it, right? Dr. Nick Vargas's work, right, speaks to that as well. Yours speaks to that of like, the idea that they do it very race evasive or race neutral, right? Of like, it's going to get to the Latino students because there's 80% of the students, right? And it's like, okay, yes, but still there's even more reason to make it right centered on them for that. And struggling through that. But then also the idea that some institutions really need the money, right? I know we went back and forth on that about like, isn't that the purpose of the funding, right? Like that HSIs, the HSI funding stream really was because they're HSIs that were struggling, right? Big time struggling, and still are. There's a good number that are still struggling. But then this idea that some were going for it for like the legitimacy, right? That it wasn't necessarily about that they really need the funding, which is the purpose of the pot of money, the federal money, but like it makes us an HSI. And if we get 4 of them, we're like, really, really good HSI, right? Like, I guess, I don't know, or we're excellent, or we get a seal of excellency, or we're super, or whatever the newest nomenclature is, right? For meaning that you're a great HSI, which I think we both know none of those things make you a great HSI, right? Probably focusing on your Latino students is going to make you a great HSI. But I loved all those complexities, right? Because you really bring up a lot of those different things that we have to stop and pause, right, and think about a little bit critically. So yeah, I thank you for talking a little bit more about it, particularly for those who haven't read it. I hope they will read it, but you really broke it down nicely. One thing I did want to ask that you didn't really go deep in the article, because it's an article, you can't say a lot, but like, is there anything you would say that what classifies those? And I don't remember all the ways in which you classified them, but the ones that were really successful at getting HSI grants, what would you say, like, to an institution that's trying to get it and they're like being unsuccessful? Like, what makes for a successful grant getting HSI?
Yeah. So that relates really well to my dissertation. So I think there's if we talk about the dis, I can certainly shed more, but the long story short of it is, I think what like your kind of institutional knowledge, at least currently, I think comes to be very important, right? Folks that are what we might call legacy HSIs, or kind of like your incumbents, right? To use the technical term. They kind of, as one of the participants shared with me, he's like, we know the do's and don'ts. What they want to hear, how they want to hear it, what they don't want to hear, how they don't want it phrased. And like that kind of knowledge in terms of the actual application process is helpful, right? When you kind of have, it's kind of the same like for folks who are maybe more seasoned scholars, right? The longer you've kind of figured out how you're supposed to respond to a reviewer, how you're supposed to kind of frame a paper, right? You're going to have more success later on in your career because you've kind of figured out how it works. I think that's a huge part. I say that very tentatively because I am curious to know how over time folks that just have much bigger and more complex grant infrastructures, right, can maybe compensate for people's knowledge, right? Whether because it's that they can outsource it. Organizations that either have really, really big grants offices, especially as we have more Hispanic serving research universities that have more developed grant infrastructures in place typically, right? There certainly are some other schools that do as well, but at the aggregate, or that they just have the financial means to be able to outsource expertise, right? And hire these fantastic grant writers that are consultants that are really expensive.
Right.
So I think that both of those things together really set folks up for success. But I'm happy to talk more about that in a bit.
Yeah, we'll get to that. We'll get to the Hispanic Serving Research Universities. I think it's just important, right? Because there are people who are trying to get the grant, the funding, and are unsuccessful because you have that population in your sample too, right? So I just was wondering if there's anything distinct. But then when you say that they know the process, right, better, they're just good at getting grants. It sounds like almost, right? Like they could get a grant for, swimming in the ocean. They could get a grant, right? Like something completely off the wall that has nothing to do with HSIs, or like, we can do that because we know how to get a grant, right? Not necessarily how to be HSIs.
Right. I think there's a combo, right? Because some of the folks really talked about, we have a really well-developed grant infrastructure, right? Or like grant expertise. And a lot of them were very specific about, we also understand exactly what this grant wants. It's not necessarily a conversation about, we know how to be great HSIs. That's separate, but they were like, we are great at knowing how to get this money. Because and part of it is like, because they've done it for a long time. But again, these other folks in the sample have also done it for a long time, but unsuccessfully. I think the difference is, partly maybe a function of just how many times, but also, that they have like folks that have stayed on maybe a while. Like some people talked about, like, we've been working on this for 20 years and it's the same group of us, right? It's hard to beat that kind of like human capital in terms of people who have been like, we got rejected last year. So then we looked at the reviews and then we retooled it for the next year. And then we also know, and we've built networks, right? So, for example, we know that 1 year we can apply for as the primary, and maybe if we get it, then the next year we can be a secondary on a cooperative. Right. So understanding how to strategically also approach the Title V program to kind of double up the monies you can get. And they were very transparent about that, saying, 1 year we'll go after that one. That means the next year, if we get it, we go after the other one with our partner over here. And they have those systems in place. And also being very, very aware and smart about how to think about competitive preference priorities and how to fold that into whatever institutional priorities they have that year, right? And being able to say, okay, this is kind of our broad aims for the year, let's say, and then the call will come out, and then they'll figure out how to put those, as one of them said, we'll figure out how to put them into alignment, right? Right. So there's like this level of strategy that I think perennial winners are really good at, which helps explain the success in the program.
Right. Wow, that's powerful. Now I'm thinking about this need for like multiple levels of consciousness, right? Like just knowing the grant process, knowing the HSI grants, knowing the fact that there's different focus each year, right? Even that, not everybody knows that, right? That there's the different strategies that the federal government is trying to get people to write about, knowing all that. And then the servingness piece, right? Which is where I talk obviously a lot about the servingness with people. And I don't talk about everything you just said, right? And I sometimes struggle with that of thinking, am I telling people to lean into like, you have to center Latino students, you have to talk about Afro-Latino students, Indigenous Latino students, multiple lingual Indigenous Latino students, right? Like, I mean, just all these different things, undocumented students. And I never say, oh, you should also really kind of understand the call, right? But you're right? Like they need to understand those technical pieces, but being a good HSI should be in there as well, right? Like it should be both.
I would hope so, yeah.
I would hope so too, but I think what we're seeing in the research, in yours included, some other articles, right, is like not necessarily, right? Like you got to be good at writing the grants and getting the specifically HSI funding stream without necessarily even talking about Latino students, which is just wild, right? And I think for those of us that think a lot about serving Latino students with HSI funding and HSI grants is like, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you center your Latino students, right? We can't rely on this trickle down effect that all boats rise when the tide rises or whatever it may be, right? Like, nah, let's focus on Latino boats, right? Let's lift the Latino boats. because HSI funding allows you to do that. So, all right. So you said that this project, I mean, obviously I've read the article multiple times, so I wanted to talk about it, but you said it wasn't directly your dissertation. So tell us, what should we be expecting to be coming out next from your dissertation work? What are you working on now? Your fans that are waiting for your next, article to drop. Tell us a little bit about what's up, what's coming up for us.
Sure. Well, let's see what happens. Reviewer number 2 has a lot of power these days. So I have days, it feels like, but I have 2 things out, that are, like I've resubmitted the R&Rs, if that makes like that stage. So I'm hopeful, but also like, the publication process be what it be.
Right.
And one of the ones in there that is a byproduct of my dissertation is really kind of talking through these sources of inequity within the program. So kind of I almost think of it as like an umbrella piece to kind of make meaning of my findings more holistically of my dissertation, but in an article form. But kind of talking about, we have this increasingly, some of the things I talk about in my work a lot is that the HSI population as a whole is increasingly diversifying across so many different lines. And yet the program was initially designed 20 plus years ago with a very particular understanding of what an HSI was. And increasingly, HSIs don't all look like that, right? They're not all public community colleges. They're very, very different. And yet we have a program in which invites everyone, like all HSIs, to compete, but with the assumption that they're all the same. So this kind of meritocratic kind of exchange, right, and how it unfolds is, I think, really problematic in the sense that there's potential implications for inequity when you have diverse kinds of actors vying for the same opportunity as if they're the same. And so I kind of elevate points of inequity or tension points, right? Is it that related to finances? Is it related to, different capacities in terms of institutional knowledge, peer networks, right? Because peer networks take a while to build, right? You don't just have those right away. And so I kind of elevate in that piece, like different, just like different moments or different sources rather of inequity within the program when it's designed in this way. And then talk about how we might re-envision this program to be more equitable. So that's one piece. I'm very hopeful, but we'll see.
I love that piece, by the way. I love when I have all these HSI ideas, like all these things. And that's one I've been wanting someone to write about. I'm like, please, somebody write about this way in which the HSI system is going to reinvent itself, right? The hierarchy we're going to see it in HSI. So thank you for doing that work, because I've been waiting for that one for a while. That one's an important piece. So reviewer 2, if you're listening, please just say yes. Just say yes already. We need this in the world. So sorry, go ahead. You were going to tell us a little bit more.
And then maybe just one other one, which I actually just resubmitted the R&R today. So we'll see what happens.
Ooh, congrats.
Is very different. It's it has been a long-term labor of love. It's a quantitative project in which I used FOIA data, so like a freedom of information request, to say it out loud, to look at all Title V applicants and recipients, right? To understand the institutional characteristics that might predict participation in this program and the success in it. So it's obviously, like most things, it's incomplete, right? I can't account for things that variables don't exist for, right?
Right.
Right. Like there's a lot of things that happen in the decision making at an institution, like who your leaders are, that there's not really a great variable for that in IPEDS.
Right.
But it's talking about very big picture, like what kinds of institutional kinds of characteristics might be related to participation in the program and then success. And so that one will hopefully, the reviewer 2 will fall in love with it again for the first time. And that will hopefully come out soonish as well.
Okay.
So those are the 2 that I'm probably most excited about.
Yeah, I'm excited about that too. So yes, again, reviewer two, if you're listening, just go ahead and let this good information get out into the world, because it's stuff, it's important, right? We do need to know these sort of like your work is just so important because it's speaking directly to the federal policy, to the institutions that are trying to figure this out, which is the reality of HSIs. People are all trying to figure this out, is like, what's going to make institutions more likely to be able to get the funding, who's more likely to go after it. We know that not all HSIs do go after the funding. I've never seen any data that shows the percentage that actually do. So if you have those, I'm excited to read that, because I say that a lot. I'm like, not all HSIs go for the funding, but I don't know the exact number either. So does that come out in there?
Yes, it's more than you would think. That don't
really?
Yeah.
Like more than 50%?
No, not more than 50, but I believe it's about a third.
Okay. Yeah.
But, you know?
Yeah.
What I think, I don't want to give away all the goodies, but
yeah, no.
It's me that there's a subset of particular kinds that don't. That is concerning to me.
Right. So yeah, it's all great work. And I hope everybody's going to start following your work if they're not already following your work, because we need to know these sort of things, right? And particularly your work is speaking to the federal government. So I'm hoping that, I'll be sharing this widely with Department of Ed folks, with NSF folks, with the big funders, right? That are currently have HSI competitive programs within their agency. So all good stuff. So I'm going to jump right into the big question that, like, I know we both want to talk about, because I said it and you said it, and I think it speaks to this hierarchy a little bit. So talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on this new alliance for Hispanic serving research universities, which includes 20 HSRIs, or what they're calling HSRUs, including your own, right? The University of North Texas, which is exciting that y'all are a part of that alliance. But when I read this article about this alliance, I immediately thought of your work. I was like, ooh, this feels hierarchy to me. So, and I know you're thinking about hierarchy of HSI. So tell me about your thoughts and your initial reactions.
So this is how I feel about it. So on the one hand, like, at least my understanding of the alliance, right? And I'm willing for it to be challenged and complemented, but is that it's really trying to double the enrollment of Latinx doctoral students. I think that's they want to double the number of Latinx identified doctoral students, and then the percentage of Latinx identified faculty by like 30%, right? Or 20%, excuse me, by like 2030. So like on its face, like, those are goals that of course I can get behind it. Like, no way am I going to be like, no, I don't want there to be more Latinx doc students or Latinx faculty.
Right.
First, like, those aims are important, and I support them a lot, right? I think that's like both things that the field of higher education as a whole needs, right? And I'm at the same time really curious to see like how these efforts actually unfold, right? Like, is it like more rhetoric, or is it actually going to be more action? There's some of that. And then perhaps I'm always a little bit weary or suspect of these like kind of pushes for like just numbers, because I really want to see them in conversations with funding parity. Right. That, if we recruit, let's say we're successful, and we being like, as if though I'm part of I guess my school is part of the alliance, but if we're successful, like, if we recruit them, like, how do we support them? Like, will we support them? What ways will we support them? And then, as you were pointing out about this notion of hierarchy, right? It's really kind of, again, this is specifically for HSIs that are considered research universities, and R1s, right? I'm just a little curious, or a little how like these kinds of like alliances might really create or accentuate differences within or among the HSI population, with it, because this is really just confined again to R1 universities, right? And it kind of in some ways like feels similar to me about like the AAU, right? Where we have like your best or whatever research universities get get put into their special group and they get to do things and get acknowledged in certain ways. And while it's great to be both a Hispanic serving institution and a research university, it's also great to be an HSI that focuses on teaching.
Right.
And it's really great to be someone that's focused on serving the community. And I'm sometimes, just because of the way of the hierarchical nature of higher education, where research universities always get placed on top, I worry that we might be kind of reaffirming that kind of rhetoric, right? Where somehow these ones are better. And they might be more productive in research, but I don't think that that makes you better in any way, right? Mm-hmm. You're designed and intended to produce research because that's the function of the kind of institution. But I hope we're all committed to students, right? And that comes in a lot of different kinds of institutional contexts, right? That have nothing to do with research. And so that's my kind of tension with it. On the one hand, like, yes, I think the goals are good. And I do want there to be more programs that are inviting and recruiting Latinx doctoral students and supporting them with funding.
Right.
Full funding.
Right.
So they work 12 jobs, okay? And research assistantships, if they want research assistantships, don't just place them doing like getting the coffee, okay? So these things are good. But I'm also really just want us to be mindful about how we don't unintentionally create more division within the HSI space, where we suggest somehow that institutions doing research are somehow better. So that's my take on it.
Yes. Thank you. I knew you were going to have some thoughts on that. I have so many thoughts. And I agree, at the surface, it seems like, okay, good goals. I wrote an article a couple years back with one of my grad students, Alberto Alvarez Guzman, and we found that the biggest perpetuators of the inequities in graduate enrollment were actually the HSRUs. Now, are any of the folks, those presidents that are leading this initiative, have they read that article? Who knows, right? Like, we don't know if they're actually reading the research, but and we didn't make that really clear. It's in there a little bit, but like, what actually gets published versus what we know as we're going into the data, that became very clear that there was the most inequities in graduate enrollment, right? So their graduate populations were much wider at a lot of those HSRUs. So I agree. Hopefully they'll get to do that work, and it brings back that idea of the need for the double consciousness, right? That you need to be good at, understand what you're good at, like fully funding grad students, do that, bringing in faculty of color and providing them with a good, lifestyle that they can thrive in your institution, do that. But also, do you understand the servingness construct, right? Do you understand what that actually means to bring in people of color into an institution that's not for them? I'm not as confident. I don't, it sounds like you're also like not sure about that same thing. But it has huge implications for the whole of HSIs in general. So thank you for that. And I think with everything HSIs, it's complicated, right? Yeah. Super complicated.
It is. Yeah. It's weird how you can both be for something, but both like for, but trepidant. I think that's probably, I think it invites to me a possibility for positive change. And I hope that they live into it.
Absolutely. I love that. Exactly. I have the same exact sentiment. So thank you for that. Awesome. So as you're talking, I think a lot about, I often wonder with scholars, what's the motivation? And a lot of times it's our own identities, right? So how does your own identities come into the research you're doing as you're thinking about challenges in these larger systems of inequity? How do your own identities come into the research?
Yeah, I guess since y'all can't see me and some of y'all might not know me, right? I'm definitely, I would say a white passing Venezuelan American, and I grew up in a really bilingual household, and there was a lot of us because I'm the baby of 6, right? So it was a loud household, and so I think when I think about my work in particular, I'm really attentive to how really higher education, but also the HSI space in particular, positions and frames Latinidad, right? Because often, not always, I do think there has been some shifts And particularly, I think the special issue that's coming, it's like coming out throughout the year, right? Good job of showing like, or pushing like more of an intersectional focus on HSIs. There often was or has been a very Chicanx or a Mexican focus within the HSI literature, which I think makes sense, right? When we think about the concentration, like all of that, it's not that I understand it. And yet I wonder, like I don't see myself in that, right? So I identify as Latina. And so I always get curious with how that gets, like Latinidad in general gets framed, understood, and what it means to serve, right? Because I mean, we say it all the time, but one size really doesn't fit all. And in particular, when you have such a pan-ethnic community, it becomes hard, right? To think about like how we can take that up and what it might mean and what kinds of policies make the most sense. And also that there's a lot of like within, like they think we don't, like there's so much difference within the Latinx population with very different political leanings, very different like needs, wants, statuses, all these kinds of things make it real complicated. And so that's probably how I think about it when I think about my own work, is trying to take a moment to at least think, particularly because I often think about policy, right? And the way policy is often construed is like, what could, for better or worse, I think we're kind of worse, but how it can serve the most people. But like in most people, I don't often show up.
Right.
And so I try to really think more about, what can equity look like when you have such a diverse group of individuals and also in this case, organizations. So particularly when I think about HSIs and how like all the organizational differences and resource differences among them. So that's kind of how it goes up. I'm always thinking about there's so much difference. And I think that that's made real to me because while I'm Latina, I'm a different kind of Latina than what I often see in the US context and who my friends have been. So that's how I see it. Yeah,
for sure. Thank you. It speaks to the need for intersectionality work, right? And one of the reasons why we did that call for that special issue or that special topic, they don't call them issues because they come out in different issues, but the special topic was because exactly what you said, right? We have this like one monolithic way of thinking about Latino, Latinx, Latine, Hispanic, and it's not, it's just not. So thank you for continuing to bring that, into the work that we're doing around HSIs, because we need it. We need a lot of different complex ways of thinking about it. So speaking of scholars, who are your HSI, I would say scholar heroes? Who do you follow or who do you see emerging? It's fun to know who's going to be coming up in the HSI scholar world that you would shout out.
So even though you probably don't want me to toot your own horn, Gina, but I'll at least say why I like your work.
Okay, thank
you. I think that makes it, it's not just because you're prolific, right? It's not just a sheer quantity. It's because there's not a lot of folks, even when you think about higher ed more broadly, like that take a real org-y, like org level analysis kind of focus. And you want to find exemplars of people who do that well and do that often so that you can learn, right? I'm still early enough in my career where I'm like, and I hope I'm always learning, right? Because that's kind of the whole like cool selling points of this kind of job, right? But yeah, that I can look and learn and continue to grow in my thinking about organizational level kinds of analyses, particularly within the HSI context. So for that reason, I'm a little bit of a fan.
Thank you. It's mutual. I'm a fan of your work too, for the same reasons, because the org level analysis, like we have to do that org level analysis, and not everybody does.
Yeah, and I say that saying like there's a lot of individual level analysis that I think are beautiful, powerful, but those are not typically the questions I ask.
Yeah.
And it's like a both and, like both of the kinds of studies are really important. But when I'm thinking about like, how can I do my own work better? Or how can I think in more nuanced ways? It's helpful to have folks that are doing that. Yeah. Someone else who whose work I admire a lot is Nicholas Vargas. he's really race conscious, talks a lot about racialization. Like the race forwardness of his work to me is really powerful, and it feels very unapologetic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's helped me think about my own work. And yeah, I think he does an incredible job. I also think, again, sometimes we get stuck in these higher ed containers, and like being able to mix folks who have different kinds of training, I think makes your work more interesting. And so to learn how he thinks about theory and stuff like that, to me, is cool. In terms of like more emerging folks, I'll probably say two really quick. I'm going to shout out my girl, Cynthia Villarreal.
Mm-hmm.
She recently came out with a piece, also in the special topic, not issue.
Topic.
Very open. And partly because just to give a shout out to this piece really quickly, she talks a lot about faculty hiring in general in the course of her work. But I thought it was really cool the way in which she married borderlands theory to talk about how hiring functions as a borderland space, right? Where insiders allow outsiders in, right? There's like a gatekeeping mechanism. I just thought, yeah, totally, right? Like I've read Borderlands in so many different ways, and I never thought about it in the context of hiring. And I think it speaks to someone who's like a cool thinker when they're able to like take theories that I've seen a lot, but use them in really innovative ways to really talk about important issues. Like faculty hiring is super important. We need, especially as we're even thinking about this conversation we just had about the Alliance, but how do we actually recruit more faculty of color and and so like those kinds of moves to me were just, I was like, I learned something this week. I just read the so like it was even cooler.
Me too. I just read it the other day. Same thing. I was fangirling big time. I was like, oh, brilliant. It's a really important, brilliant piece.
And then someone else whose work I just think is really strong is Elvira Albrica. And if I said your name wrong, I'm really sorry, but I'm trying. Because I in some of the work that I've read of hers, she really talks about anti-Blackness within the Latinx community and within the HSI context. And I think that that's something, it's increasingly, I think we're seeing more conversations around that now. But for a long time, I feel like it was something that got pushed under the rug. Like we talking about Latinos in general didn't often always were upfront about the ways in which we produce and reified anti-Blackness. And so I think it was really important kind of work to kind of confront some of the things that we need to do better and think better and differently about. And so I've really appreciated some of the articles that she's written, because I think she has a few that really kind of pull that forward. And I'm like, oh yeah. And it's actually made me think about how to have conversations with my family. And you know, those are not, and I don't know that I would have had the, maybe the languaging to be able to explain it as well had I not read her pieces.
Yeah.
So,
awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Did you have more?
No, those are the two that I'm just like, I mean, there's a lot of folks doing super cool stuff, right?
Yeah.
That's one thing that I'm excited about when I think about the HSI space in general is that there are so many more people now writing on HSIs. It's an increasingly growing body of research. And so I'm like, I want to know who all the new folks are. I don't know who they all are yet. But I do know that as I see new and new articles coming out, I'm like, oh, there's more, you know? And so like, I'm excited of all the things that I know I will come to learn soon.
Yes, I agree. It's an exciting time in a scholar space that was nearly non-existent 10 years ago, you know, particularly around empirical research. It was almost non-existent. There was, you know, a few pieces and just it hadn't emerged the way it's emerged really in the last 10 years. So it's exciting. It's exciting time for those of us that are really doing this kind of work. So thank you for that. And shout out to all the folks you shouted out. I'm fans of their work as well. So to wrap up, the final question, if you could summarize in like one sentence or maybe two, ¿Qué pasa, HSIs?
I want to know when HSIs as a whole will put their money where their mouth is.
Ooh, I like that. Okay, that's a good one.
I think that's And I think there are some that do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I want to know when the collective, we can say, by and large, yeah, they do that. And so that's what I'll leave it with. I think that's what's up.
Yeah, I agree. It's totally what's up. So thank you for leaving us with that. So thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Aguilar-Smith. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I'm excited to share with the world the work that you're doing. For those of you that aren't yet aware, hopefully they'll become big fans and start following your work because you're doing really great work. So thank you.
Thank you so much.